Hi there, personal health and wellness. Welcome to our module concerning sexual and reproductive health. Probably not one of the things that first comes to mind when you take a class like personal health, but now that you kind of have had a chance to soak in the idea that we're going to address this topic, maybe it does actually kind of fit a little bit more in the schema of what personal health and the dimensions of it all involve. And so I really feel like this is a very important module. It's a very difficult one, obviously, to talk about because of the sensitive nature of the content. But one of the things that I hope that you do is you walk away from this module, first of all, knowing where some resources are. But second of all, having a deeper appreciation for what you have in your sexual health and what that can bring to your life. So, to begin, I want to ask you a series of questions. Number one is sex a good or a bad thing? Can you label this for me if I gave you a checkbox good, a checkbox bad? What is it that you would do to position yourself with a healthy place for sexual health? And I would hope that you would say that this is a positive thing towards my health, because I personally believe that that's the intent of sexual health and the ability to participate in sex. And so when we look at the content as we go forward, many times it's kind of seen as a taboo kind of thing, but we need to open up our ability to have conversations, especially with our loved ones, about what this is, and to be honest, and just when you don't know, say I don't know, and to be willing to research together what is a positive thing, and to create more positivity with that, especially between you and your partner. So I go into question number two, and I have to ask this. Did you have a sex talk? I mean, what was the origin of your knowledge in sex? And chances are it was not with a sex talk with people who cared about you, like your parents. It probably happened at school or between friends well before a sex talk was even positioned to occur. And so, what I hope happens here is that you can start to develop certain talking points and criterion on what a good sex talk would be. Almost exclusively to my in class, I will ask this question and get an answer that is almost every time the same thing, that we didn't get a sex talk, or I didn't get a sex talk. And I have to also agree, I didn't get one, at least not one of value. And so when I consider the value of what it could be, I'm very disappointed. And I hope that I deliver something better to my children. Although I have to confess, I'm not looking forward to that. And it's coming very soon, but it's something that I know is very necessary in the development of their own appreciation for good sexual health. So we go into question number three. And question number three is basically, when would you be satisfied to no longer have sex in your life? And I want you to pause and kind of think about this. At what age are you going to say, I am completely satisfied that I will never have sex again? And I would imagine that that's kind of a stunning question, because that would mean that you are putting a time limit on when sex is going to no longer be important. And I think what you would find is that if you polled that question to a series of even elderly people, that they would still tell you that sex is important to them. And so, what I'm trying to do is position this conversation into a place where you understand that sex is going to be important to you throughout your lifespan. And if you want to be able to participate in sex throughout your lifespan, then you need to protect what it is that you have now so that you can have it again later. Remember the Joyce Meyer statement: wisdom is doing now what will make you happy later. Well, having a very positive but also deep appreciation for your current sexual health now will enable you to have sex across your lifespan later. So, that being said, let me kind of bring this in, uh, and that is some terms that we want to start with, and what you're going to hear me talk about through the next few moments, and that is sexually transmitted infection. That is an infection that occurs directly from a sex act, and you're going to kind of see some of the specific infections that we are going to look at here in just a moment. There's another term, unprotected sex. That means that you are having sex with a partner, and there is no protection, specifically that of condoms or even any other type of preventative measure. And so we'll kind of get into some of those as well. And then this third term, and I hope that you've all heard this term before, but that is abstinence. That means that you abstain from sex. And this is the only true safe sex. That is abstinence, that you're not having sex. And that can take you into positions of preventing unplanned pregnancy or even possibly sexually transmitted infection. My next slide here is this. With sexually transmitted infection comes specific signs and symptoms. And with those signs and symptoms, they're pretty much common across the gender spectrum. You're going to see drippage, you're going to see burning, you're going to see itching, you're going to see pain, and these all coming from different sex organs. Now, on the other side of that is many times with this out of the equation, there are no real signs and symptoms of an STI or STD. This is the most you're going to see. And so sometimes they go for a very long time before diagnosis occurs. Some of the bacterial infections out there that we know of, first of all, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis, and we're going to see some things about those here in just a moment. But these are all things that can be treated with antibiotics. The other side of that coin are viruses that occur from sexually transmitted infection, and those being herpes, HPV or the human papillomavirus, hepatitis B, and then ultimately HIV or AIDS, which are the ones that typically are thought of as the very difficult to treat STIs. So I bring you back to healthypeople.gov because I want to go into the topics and objectives, and that specifically in sexually transmitted diseases, because right here is a vast and robust um, resource center for us to begin our conversation with. First of all, we know that STDs that do occur are very high in burden, cost, and complication. They can cause reproductive health problems, meaning that can affect the level of what you're able to do reproductively. What we know is that syphilis has caused 200,000 stillbirths in 1 year. And so that's a big problem in the respect to the baby trying to be born. Another thing is it changes fetal and perinatal health in the fetus that does, or the baby that does survive. Um, we see some long-term effects from that, and that extends all the way from different birth defects all the way to potentially HIV and AIDS being passed into that baby. Another unique thing here is cancer. We've seen over the past few years how HPV, human papillomavirus, has been directly connected to both cervical, but also other types of cancer, and also problems with males. And so we're going to get to a nice little slide where we talked about HPV and opportunities that are now available for the vaccination. Another thing, facilitation of the sexual transmission of HIV. And this is something that when I was growing up in the 1980s, we heard about HIV, we heard about AIDS. We kind of thought about it to be more apocalyptic in nature, that it was going to be something that was going to chase down or tear down our sexual status, and what we now found out was that we've come a long way through education. We've come a long way, but it's still a very serious condition out there, and so we want to get more education out there. Why is sexually transmitted disease prevention important? The CDC estimates there are approximately 20 million new STD infections each year. And so for our population, that's a lot. Another thing here is most of those, half of those anyways, are from ages 15 to 24. That means there's a whole nother half out there around that age group. And so that means that people 15 to 24 are not the only sexually active people in our population. And they're also not the only ones who are experiencing STDs, which may be kind of shocking to you, but that actually comes about through older generations or in older populations as well. Um, there are some really unique things here occurring, racial and ethnic disparities. And I want to point this out. Certain racial and ethnic groups, mainly African American, Hispanic, American Indian, Alaska Native populations, have the highest rates of STDs. Poverty and marginalization here. The STDs disproportionately affect disadvantaged people, and people in social networks where high risk sexual behavior is common. And so that probably kind of tends to lend itself more into the poorer populations where we're seeing less opportunity, less resources, also less education that has some disparity to it as well. Access to healthcare is a really big problem. Healthy People 2020 really wants to level that out, but access to high quality healthcare is essential for early detection. And so, what you may need to understand is that you don't have to be able to afford to go to your primary care doctor to be tested. Health departments do that as well, and those are readily available to you, with a lot of anonymity to that. Substance abuse, which is what we talked about in the former module, it says many studies document the association of substance abuse with STDs, and that all coming back to lowered inhibitions and higher risk, all coming from if you're willing to do this, then you're willing to do that. And then sexuality and secrecy. We all know that secrecy is tied very closely to sexuality, and it says perhaps the most important social factors contribute to the spread of STDs in the United States are the stigma associated with those, because we're not talking about them and sharing that information. You know, if you were to get sick and have a stomach virus, you might put that all over Facebook, but you're probably not going to share the fact that you have an STD, right? So that is kind of the biggest thing going on out there, is that they're not being shared. You're not communicating that to your sexual partners, and so therefore spreading of an STD is very common. And then there's this other thing called a sexual network, and that is groups of people who can be considered linked by either sequential or concurrent sex partners. And so those networks are occurring with multiple sex partners, and they're happening often. And so there we're seeing, again, kind of a greater risk behavior occurring with STD to be involved. Now, I come back up to the top because I want to give you some resources here. Again, lots of really good articles and papers out there having to do with sexual and reproductive health. But I want to kind of give you some information here. This is where you can find out about being tested specifically for chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. Remember, those are the bacterial infections that are very well and easily treated with antibiotics. But there's also this nice little component here, and that has to do with the HPV vaccine. And you know, a lot of us are still uneducated on what that means. And men or boys and girls are both uh, candidates for HPV, especially at certain ages, and what that can do for them. Um, HPV is something that can cause cancer. It can cause vaginal cancer, penile cancer, anal cancer, also cancer to the back of the throat and then the genital area. And so, what we know is that this is something that's very commonly associated with a sexually transmitted infection, but it's also very preventable in the fact that it has a vaccine. Now, a side note here, I'm not really sure that I'm going to let my children be vaccinated yet. I just haven't had enough conversations with my wife to know that that's something that we're ready to do. All the information that I read definitely makes me want to do that. However, this is a conversation that I need to have because with my wife, because we're both stakeholders in their health. And so it's something that will come, but I would encourage you to also seek out that same kind of um, dialogue with your loved ones to identify if that's something that's good for you and your child. But there are several things here to learn more about HPV. That's your spot to kind of get that going. Talking about both boys and girls, when to have that done, the safety that's involved with HPV is also listed there. So I want to go ahead and come back to now this starting point of what else we could look at. Syphilis testing here. Um, and then talking about sex with your teens, specifically STDs. And that kind of leads me into what's coming. Obviously, you'll see a quiz down here, and all of the answers to your quizzes can be found in this content right here, but also in the content before that we looked at. And then you have an assignment, and that is to list the top 10 talking points and then your rationale for why those are your top 10 talking points on each for having the sex talk with a loved one. That could be a child, that could be just a friend who is in need, that could be maybe a niece or a nephew. But you're going to be the person having to present this. And the reason I want you to do this is because, regardless of your history with the sex talk, I think it's important to start building that rationale now, because someone does look up to you, and you could be that person who changes everything for a younger person or someone coming up who has questions. Remember, you're always a mentor. You always have a mentor. And so seek that out. Ask people you know. Maybe go back to your parents and say, hey, look, we didn't have this talk, but now we're both more mature. Let's talk about it now. But that is your assignment. Go ahead and go through the quiz. Again, all of that can be found on these pages right here, this one and the one before it, concerning sexually transmitted diseases. Go ahead and take the quiz, start your assignment. I hope that this has kind of got you started. I want to leave you with one thought, though. And this was kind of a profound statement that came across in a church sermon by my preacher, and it was probably the most profound way I've ever heard it said. And that is that sex is a good thing, especially when it's between two married people and a relationship where they care about each other. And it's kind of like having a fire in your home. As long as that fire is kept within the fireplace, everyone enjoys the fire. The whole family enjoys the fire. But when that fire escapes the fireplace, when sex comes outside of those two people and it goes outside of that marriage, then a lot of people are hurt, they're injured, and sometimes the house burns down. And so if you kind of keep that in the position of sexual health, then you understand that my position is sex is a good thing, it's a positive thing, and it should be valued between two people. But what you also have to understand is that when it gets out of that, when your sexual network is expanded past those two people, people get hurt. You know this because it's probably happened. You've seen this happen in other people's lives. People get hurt, but also the house can burn down. And if that happens, then the sexual health is damaged. And so I go back to my third question. How long do you want to continue to have sex? Because if you take care of that baby bird that is your sexual health, then you can have sex for a long time. But a sexually transmitted infection can change the opportunities and the timeline of which you could participate in sex. I hope this was a valuable conversation for you. Let me know. Send me an email. Send me a conversation on the phone. Hope to talk to you soon. See ya.